The pearl buttons resisted my trembling fingers like tiny sentinels guarding a secret I couldn't name. Each one seemed designed to mock me, positioned exactly where my shoulders couldn't quite reach, where flexibility gave way to the rigid panic settling into my spine. The dressing room of St. Catherine's Chapel smelled of lilies and old incense, a combination that had once seemed romantic, but now made my stomach turn with each shallow breath. I'd been alone for 17 minutes. I knew because I'd watched the antique clock on the wall tick through each excruciating second since Iris had rushed out to check on something. A commotion near the altar, she'd said, her face pale beneath her bridesmaid's makeup. That was a lie. I'd seen it in the way her eyes had darted away from mine, in the hesitation before she pulled the door closed. The mirror before me reflected a stranger in cream silk and Belgian lace, my dark hair arranged in an elaborate updo that had taken 2 hours and felt like it weighed 10 pounds. My grandmother's veil cascaded down my back, the same one my mother had worn, tiny seed pearls catching the afternoon light that filtered through the stained glass windows. I looked like a bride from a magazine. I felt like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff. My fingers found the next button, slipped, tried again. The fabric of the gown was exquisite. French silk with a subtle sheen that changed color as I moved, from champagne to pale gold. I'd chosen it myself, insisted on this particular design even though the seamstress had warned me about the buttons. "They're authentic vintage," she'd said. "Beautiful but impractical. You'll need help getting dressed." I'd laughed then, told her my fiancé would help me, that we'd have a lifetime of helping each other with difficult buttons. The clock ticked. 18 minutes now. Through the thick wooden door, I could hear nothing. No music, no murmur of guests, no indication that 200 people waited in the pews beyond. The silence was worse than any sound could have been. It confirmed what some part of me had suspected since waking this morning with a sense of dread I couldn't explain, that something was fundamentally wrong. I reached for my phone, sitting on the small vanity table beside a bouquet of white roses that were already beginning to wilt in the warm room. 3 missed calls from Iris, 7 from numbers I didn't recognize, and 1 text message that made my blood run cold. "He's gone. I'm so sorry. He's gone." The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor. The screen cracked in a spiderweb pattern that seemed to mirror the fracturing happening inside my chest. Gone. The word echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls of my skull with increasing volume. Gone. How could he be gone? We'd rehearsed last night. He'd kissed me goodbye at my apartment door, promised to meet me at the altar, told me he loved me. He'd lied. My hands found the edge of the vanity, gripping until my knuckles whitened. The same vanity where generations of brides had prepared themselves, checking their reflections one final time before walking toward their futures. How many of them had stood here feeling what I felt now? This particular species of humiliation that came from being left, from being deemed insufficient, from being found wanting at the moment that should have been triumph. I needed to get out of this dress, needed to shed this costume of a future that would never happen. But the buttons. God, the buttons. My arms ached from reaching, from contorting, from the impossible task of undoing what I'd been fool enough to fasten with Iris's help an hour ago. The door handle turned. I spun toward it, hope and dread warring in my chest. Maybe it was him. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe this was all a terrible misunderstanding, and he was here to tell me. Hands appeared first. Male hands, large and sure, with long fingers that moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. They reached toward me, and I froze, my breath catching as they found the top button at the base of my neck, the one I'd been struggling with for the past 5 minutes. "Allow me," a voice said, deep, accented with something Mediterranean that turned the vowels liquid and warm. Italian, perhaps, or somewhere nearby. The hands worked the button free with disturbing precision. I should have screamed, should have demanded to know who this stranger was, how he'd entered without knocking, what gave him the right to touch me. But I stood paralyzed, watching in the mirror as a figure materialized behind me. Tall, broad-shouldered beneath a charcoal suit that fit with the perfection that came from Italian tailoring, not off-the-rack alterations. Dark hair, graying slightly at the temples. A face that would have been handsome, if not for the hardness in it. The kind of hardness that came from seeing too much, doing too much, surviving what should have killed softer men. His fingers moved to the second button. "Who are you?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who knows about difficult buttons," he replied, not meeting my eyes in the mirror. His attention remained fixed on his task, methodical and practiced. "And someone who, unlike your absent groom, keeps his promises." The second button came free. Then the third. "How did you—" I started, but he interrupted. "Your groom fled with another woman approximately 53 minutes ago. A blonde named Melissa, who works at his firm. They left in her car, heading north. The guests are beginning to realize something is wrong. Your friend Iris is attempting to manage the situation, but she's failing. This will be a scandal by dinner time." Each word landed like a physical blow. 53 minutes. He'd been gone nearly an hour while I'd stood in this room, struggling with buttons, believing this was just a delay. And this stranger knew. This man I'd never seen before had information that should have been impossible for him to possess. "You're lying," I said, but there was no conviction in the words. "I rarely lie. It's inefficient." The fourth button, the fifth. His fingers brushed against my skin, barely touching, but enough to raise goosebumps despite the warmth of the room. Though I do occasionally omit details when complete honesty would be inconvenient. "Stop," I said. "Stop touching me. Get out." He paused, his hands hovering just below my shoulder blades. In the mirror, his eyes finally met mine. They were dark brown, almost black, with a depth that suggested intelligence and something else, a calculation happening behind them, an assessment being made. "I could leave," he said softly. "Let you struggle with these buttons for another 20 minutes, then face a chapel full of guests who already know you've been abandoned. Or you could let me finish what I've started, and then we could have a conversation about why I'm really here. Why are you here?" "To collect a debt." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I couldn't begin to understand. A debt. What debt? I owed nothing. I'd lived carefully, modestly, on the income from my work as a translator and the small inheritance my grandmother had left me. My life was simple, contained, deliberately free of entanglements. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. "No," he agreed. "You wouldn't. Your father made sure of that." His hands resumed their work, quicker now, as if he'd made a decision. "Charles Dubois, your father, dead 6 years, officially from a heart attack, though the stress of stealing 3 million euros probably contributed." The room tilted. My father. My quiet, methodical father, who'd worked as a corporate accountant, who'd taught me to balance a checkbook, who'd never owned anything flashier than a 5-year-old sedan, who'd died when I was 19, leaving me with enough insurance money for college and a small apartment, but nothing extraordinary. "My father was honest," I said, but my voice betrayed my uncertainty. Because wasn't that what everyone said? Didn't every criminal's child believe in their parents' integrity until confronted with evidence otherwise? "Your father was desperate." The stranger's voice softened almost imperceptibly. He had gambling debts, significant ones. Debts to people who don't accept excuses or payment plans. So he did what desperate men do. He stole from someone powerful enough to make those debts disappear. He stole from me. The last button came free. The gown loosened around my shoulders, and I felt suddenly exposed despite still being fully clothed. I clutched the fabric to my chest, turning to face him directly rather than through the mirror's mediation. "You're lying," I repeated. "My father would never—" "Your father spent 18 months embezzling from accounts I used for legitimate business operations. By the time I discovered the theft, he'd moved the money through 6 different countries and died before I could recover it." He stepped back, giving me space, his hands folding behind him in a posture that suggested military training. "He left you as collateral. A contract signed in his own hand, witnessed and notarized, stating that should he fail to repay the debt within 10 years, his daughter would serve as settlement." I wanted to laugh. This was insane. Contracts didn't work that way. People couldn't be used as collateral. This was the 21st century, not some Victorian melodrama. "That's not legal," I said. "You can't enforce legal." He smiled, and it transformed his face into something almost gentle, which was somehow more frightening than if he'd looked cruel. "Kara, very little of what I do is legal, but it is binding within the world I inhabit. Your father knew the rules. He signed anyway. I want to see this contract." "Of course." He reached inside his jacket and produced a folded document, handing it to me with the same careful precision he'd used on my buttons. My hands shook as I opened it. The paper was thick, expensive, the letterhead unfamiliar, but the signature at the bottom, that was unmistakable. My father's flowing script, unchanged from the birthday cards and Christmas notes I'd saved. The date was 10 years ago, almost to the day. I would have been 15. I read the words, though they seemed to swim before my eyes. In the event of default, the bearer of this contract. Full settlement of debt through service. Term of no less than 1 year. "This can't be real," I whispered. "It's real." He took the document back, refolding it with the same care. "The original is in a safe deposit box in Geneva. This is a certified copy. Your signature isn't required. Your father's was sufficient." I sank onto the small chair by the vanity, my legs no longer trustworthy. The room spun around me. The flowers, the mirror, this stranger who spoke of my father's crimes as casually as if discussing the weather. Everything I thought I knew was inverting, revealing an underside I'd never suspected existed. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "What was promised?" 1 year of your life. You'll come with me, live in my home, follow certain rules. At the end of that time, the debt is cleared, and you'll be free to go. And if I refuse?" His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been regret. "Then I'll collect in other ways that would be less pleasant for both of us. Your fiancé's law firm, for instance. I understand they represent several clients who would be concerned to learn certain details about their cases. Or your friend Iris. Her cafe operates without the proper health permits, I believe. Small infractions, but enough to shut her down." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, delivered in the same calm tone he'd used to discuss my father's death. This was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, who'd learned to apply pressure at exactly the right points to achieve compliance. "You're a monster," I said. "Yes," he agreed simply. "But I'm a monster who keeps his word. 1 year, nothing more. You have my guarantee of safety, of respect, of certain comforts. It's more than most people in your position would receive." "What's your name?" "Lorenzo Conti." The name meant nothing to me, but the way he said it suggested it should. Lorenzo Conti. I filed it away, along with every other detail, the gray at his temples, the scar along his left jawline, the way his accent softened certain consonants. If I was going to survive whatever came next, I needed to observe, to learn, to find weaknesses. I need time, I said, to think. You have until the guests begin leaving. 20 minutes, perhaps. After that, your decision becomes much more public, and I'll be forced to be less courteous in my methods of persuasion. He moved toward the door, then paused. Your groom was a coward, little dove. He couldn't even tell you himself that he was leaving. I, at least, have the courtesy to explain your future to your face. The door closed behind him with a soft click. I sat alone in the dressing room, my wedding gown open at the back, my veil still pinned to my elaborate hair, my life shattered around me like the broken screen of my phone. Through the door, I could hear the first murmurs of confusion from the chapel. Guests asking questions, Iris's voice, high with stress, trying to maintain control. My father had stolen from a man named Lorenzo Conti, had signed a contract using me as collateral, had died 6 years ago, leaving me to pay for sins I'd never known he'd committed. And my fiancé had fled with another woman, leaving me alone to face this impossible choice. 1 year. Lorenzo had promised 1 year. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, at the bride I'd been so briefly, at the woman I was becoming. The pearl buttons hung loose down my back, a metaphor I was too exhausted to fully process. I thought about running, about gathering my dress and simply disappearing through the side door. But Lorenzo had tracked my father across 6 countries and waited 10 years to collect his debt. Where could I possibly run that he wouldn't follow? The clock ticked. 19 minutes had passed since Lorenzo left. I stood, letting the gown fall away, stepping out of it carefully. Underneath, I wore simple white undergarments, practical and unadorned. I folded the dress over the back of the chair, smoothing out the wrinkles with automatic movements. My hands found the pins in my hair, removing them one by one until the elaborate updo collapsed and my dark hair fell around my shoulders. In my street clothes, jeans and a sweater I'd brought for changing after the reception, I looked like myself again. Or perhaps I looked like a new version of myself, one who understood that everything was negotiable. Everyone had secrets, and sometimes survival meant accepting terms you'd never imagined having to consider. I picked up my grandmother's veil from where it had fallen, folding it carefully into my bag. Whatever came next, I wouldn't leave that behind. Some things were worth keeping, even when everything else was lost. The door opened without my touching it. Lorenzo stood there, his expression unreadable. "Have you decided?" he asked. I met his eyes, finding that place inside myself where stubbornness lived alongside fear. 1 year, and then I'm free. 1 year? He confirmed. You have my word. The word of a monster, I said. The only kind of word that matters, he replied, because monsters at least are honest about what they are. He extended his hand toward me, and I stared at it for a long moment before placing my palm against his. His grip was firm, warm, and I felt the calluses that suggested he didn't spend all his time behind a desk. This was a man who knew physical work, who'd built his power through methods I probably didn't want to imagine. Come, he said. I have a car waiting. Your things will be collected from your apartment and delivered tomorrow. Just like that? I don't get to say goodbye. Would you prefer a farewell scene? Explanations you can't give? Questions you can't answer? His thumb brushed across my knuckles, a gesture that felt almost gentle. Sometimes, little dove, disappearing is a mercy to those left behind. He guided me through a side door I hadn't noticed, down a narrow hallway that bypassed the chapel entirely. Outside, the afternoon sun felt wrong. Too bright, too warm for what felt like the ending of everything. A black car waited, its engine running, and a man in a dark suit opened the rear door as we approached. I looked back once at St. Catherine's Chapel, at the place where I should have been married, where my life should have begun its next chapter. Instead, I was climbing into a stranger's car, my hand still held in his. My future contracted away before I'd been old enough to know such things were possible. "Where are we going?" I asked as the car pulled away from the curb. "Liguria," Lorenzo replied. "The Italian coast. I have a property there. You'll find it quite beautiful, I think. A prison is still a prison, no matter how beautiful." He smiled at that, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger. "Then we shall see, in 1 year's time, whether you still think of it as a prison, or if perhaps it became something else entirely." The city blurred past the tinted windows, and I watched it disappear. The life I'd known, the future I'd planned, the woman I'd been just hours ago. In her place sat someone I didn't yet recognize, someone capable of sitting calmly beside a man who called himself a monster. Someone who'd agreed to trade a year of her life for debts she'd never incurred. My father's ghost sat heavy in the silence between us. I wanted to hate him for what he'd done, for the choices he'd made that had led to this moment. But all I could feel was a strange, distant sadness. He'd been desperate. He'd been afraid. He'd made terrible decisions and died before facing their full consequences. Now I would face them instead. Lorenzo's phone buzzed, and he answered it in rapid Italian, his voice taking on a harder edge. Business, clearly. The business of whatever empire he'd built, whatever power he wielded, that made contracts like the one bearing my father's signature enforceable in his world if not in mine. When he ended the call, silence filled the car again. Not uncomfortable, exactly, but weighted with all the things neither of us was saying. I had 1,000 questions. Where would I live? What would be expected of me? What did service mean in the context of his contract? But I found I couldn't ask any of them. Couldn't quite believe this was real, that my life had pivoted so completely in the space of a single afternoon. "You may ask," Lorenzo said softly, as if reading my thoughts. "I prefer honesty to speculation." "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Really, what does this year mean?" He considered the question, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. "I want what your father took from me. Not the money. That's merely numbers, easily replaced. I want what he stole that can't be so easily recovered. Time, trust, the belief that contracts matter and debts are honored." He turned to look at me then, his expression serious. "You are the embodiment of that debt. Your presence, your service, your acknowledgement that actions have consequences. That's what this year means. That's a lot of philosophy for what amounts to kidnapping. I didn't kidnap you. You came willingly. Under duress. Under awareness of the alternatives," he corrected. "There's a difference. You chose this path because you understood the others would be worse. That's not duress. That's intelligence." We drove in silence after that, leaving the city behind, heading north towards something I couldn't yet imagine. My wedding day, begun with such hope, ended with me in the backseat of a stranger's car, my dress abandoned in a chapel dressing room. My groom fled with another woman. My future rewritten by a contract signed when I was 15 years old. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been romantic in any other context. In this one, they felt like the closing of a door, the end of one life, and the reluctant beginning of another. Lorenzo's hand rested on the seat between us, close enough to touch, but not touching. I stared at it, at the fingers that had unbuttoned my dress with such practiced ease, and wondered what other things those hands had done, what violence they'd committed, what empires they'd built, what other desperate people they'd controlled. 1 year, I said aloud, needing to hear the words. 1 year, he confirmed. And then, little dove, you'll be free to fly away. But as the car carried us toward the coast, toward Italy, toward whatever waited in that beautiful prison by the sea. I couldn't shake the feeling that freedom was something that had already left me behind. Abandoned in a dressing room full of wilted roses, alongside a wedding gown with pearl buttons that had been too difficult for one person to manage alone, the villa appeared at dusk, perched on cliffs that dropped dramatically into the Ligurian Sea. I watched it materialize through the car window like something from a dream, or a particularly sophisticated nightmare. White stone walls caught the last rays of sunlight, turning them golden, while bougainvillea cascaded down terraces in violent bursts of magenta and deep purple. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache, the kind of beauty that felt like a punishment for crimes I hadn't committed. "Home," Lorenzo said simply, as if the word could encompass the sprawling estate before us. The car passed through iron gates that opened automatically, gliding up a drive lined with cypress trees that stood like dark sentinels against the twilight sky. I counted them, 23 on each side, because focusing on numbers kept me from thinking about what came next, about the fact that I was voluntarily entering a place I might not be able to leave. Felix, the man who'd driven us from the chapel, brought the car to a stop before a set of double doors carved with intricate patterns I couldn't quite make out in the fading light. He opened my door with the same practiced deference he'd shown throughout the journey, his expression neutral, but not unkind. He'd said perhaps 5 words to me in the past 6 hours, all of them courteous and completely uninformative. Lorenzo offered his hand as I stepped out, and I took it automatically, still not quite believing any of this was real. The air smelled different here, salt and citrus and something floral I couldn't identify. Jasmine, perhaps. The sound of waves reached me from somewhere below the cliffs, a constant rhythm that should have been soothing but instead felt like a clock counting down the days of my captivity. "Come," Lorenzo said, his hand shifting to the small of my back, guiding me toward the entrance. "You must be exhausted. I'll show you to your rooms, and then we can discuss the arrangements over dinner." "I'm not hungry," I lied. In truth, I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and my stomach had been growling for the past hour. "Nevertheless, you'll eat. I don't maintain guests who harm themselves through neglect." His tone was mild but absolute, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in even the smallest matters. The interior of the villa matched its exterior in understated elegance. No guilt, no ostentation, just clean lines and carefully chosen pieces that spoke of wealth so secure it didn't need to announce itself. The floors were terracotta, worn smooth by what must have been centuries of footsteps. The walls held paintings I suspected were originals, though I was no expert. The furniture looked antique but comfortable, arranged in ways that suggested people actually lived here, that this wasn't just a showpiece. A woman appeared from a doorway to our left, older, perhaps 60, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a simple black dress and an expression that managed to be both professional and deeply disapproving. "Signora Rosa," Lorenzo said, and something in his tone shifted, became warmer. "This is Hazel. She'll be staying with us for a time. Please prepare the East Suite and have dinner sent up in an hour." Rosa's gaze traveled over me with the thoroughness of a customs inspector, taking in my jeans, my sweater, the bag I clutched like a lifeline. When her eyes met mine, I saw no sympathy there, just a cool assessment that found me somehow lacking. "As you wish," she said in accented English, her voice making it clear this was not at all as she wished. She turned and disappeared down a hallway, her footsteps echoing on the terracotta with military precision. "Rosa manages the household," Lorenzo explained, guiding me toward a staircase that curved upward along the far wall. "She's been with my family since I was a child. Her disapproval is legendary, but ultimately harmless. She doesn't approve of me being here. She doesn't approve of many things. It's one of her more endearing qualities." The staircase led to a second floor, with a long corridor punctuated by heavy wooden doors. Lorenzo stopped at the third one, producing a key from his pocket, with a flourish that felt almost mocking. "Your rooms," he said, unlocking the door and pushing it open. I stepped inside and felt my breath catch despite my determination not to show any reaction. The suite was enormous, larger than my entire apartment had been. A sitting area occupied the space near the windows, which I could see even in the gathering darkness overlooked the sea. Beyond that, through an open archway, I glimpsed a bedroom with a 4-poster bed that could have slept 4 people comfortably. Another door presumably led to a bathroom. The decor continued the villa's aesthetic of understated luxury. Cream-colored walls, dark wood furniture, touches of gold in the mirror frames and light fixtures. Fresh flowers, white roses and that jasmine I'd smelled outside, filled a vase on a small table. Everything was immaculate, as if these rooms had been prepared specifically for my arrival. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, turning to face Lorenzo, who stood in the doorway, watching me with that unsettling focus that suggested he saw more than I wanted him to see. "The rooms have been ready for some time. I knew this day would come eventually. Your father's contract had a term. When it expired without repayment, I began making arrangements. You've been watching me. For how long?" He didn't deny it. 2 years, since the contract's expiration date approached. I needed to know where you were, what your circumstances were, whether you presented any flight risk. The violation of it settled over me like a physical weight. 2 years. He'd been tracking me, observing me, learning my habits and routines while I'd gone about my life in blissful ignorance. Every coffee shop I'd frequented, every late night at the translation agency, every dinner with Iris. He'd known. He'd been there, invisible but present. "You knew about the wedding," I said, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "That's why you waited until today. Maximum impact." "I knew about the wedding," he confirmed, "and about your fiancé's affair with Melissa. I knew he would run. The man was a coward. It was only a matter of when he'd reveal it. You could have told me, warned me. To what end? You wouldn't have believed a stranger, and even if you had, you'd have married him anyway. People rarely abandon their carefully constructed illusions until reality forces the issue." He stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him. This way was cleaner, one crisis instead of several. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't quite convince myself. Would I have believed warnings about my fiancé from a man claiming my dead father owed him millions? Or would I have dismissed it as an elaborate scam, some attempt to extort money or disrupt my life? "Your things will arrive tomorrow," Lorenzo continued, moving to the windows and drawing the curtains closed with efficient movements. "Rosa has placed some essentials in the bathroom, and the armoire contains clothing in your size if you need something before your belongings arrive." "More preparation," I said bitterly. "More watching and planning. I'm thorough. It's how I've survived in a business where carelessness is often fatal." He turned back to me, and in the lamplight, his features seemed softer, the harsh lines of his face slightly blurred. "I understand you're angry. You have every right to be, but anger won't change your circumstances. Adaptation will serve you better." "Is that what you tell all your prisoners? Adapt or suffer?" I tell them to be intelligent about their situation, to recognize what can be changed and what can't, to choose their battles with care. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "The door locks from the inside. You have complete privacy in these rooms. However, the windows are sealed and alarmed. If you attempt to leave through them, Felix will know within seconds, and I'll be forced to implement less pleasant security measures. I'd rather not." "Less pleasant than being a captive?" "Yes." The single word carried a weight that made my skin prickle. "I've given you the courtesy of comfort and autonomy. Don't make me regret it." He left, the door closing with a soft click that somehow sounded like a cell door locking. I stood in the center of the enormous room, my bag still clutched in my hand, and felt the full weight of my situation settle over me. This was real. This was happening. I was in Italy, in a villa on the Ligurian coast, the property of a man who called himself a monster, and proved it through actions that were all the more frightening for their calm efficiency. My phone, still cracked from where I'd dropped it in the chapel, showed no signal. Of course not. I was willing to bet Lorenzo controlled the Wi-Fi here, monitored every byte of data that came in or out. Even if I could call for help, who would I call? The police? And tell them what? That I was being held against my will based on a contract my father had signed? A contract that probably wouldn't stand up in any legitimate court but carried weight in whatever shadow world Lorenzo inhabited? I moved to the windows, pulling back the curtain Lorenzo had just closed. Beyond the glass, the sea stretched out in darkening shades of blue and gray, the horizon line barely visible. Lights from distant boats flickered like fallen stars. It was beautiful. Devastatingly, impossibly beautiful. And I would have traded it all for my cramped apartment in the city, with its leaking faucet and noisy neighbors and complete ordinary freedom. A knock at the door made me turn. "Signora?" Rosa's voice, still disapproving. "Come in," I said, because what else could I say? She entered carrying a tray laden with covered dishes, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd performed this task thousands of times. She set it on the small dining table near the sitting area, removing the covers to reveal pasta in what smelled like a cream sauce, a green salad, bread that must have been baked that day, and a bottle of wine alongside a carafe of water. "Signor Conti asks that you eat," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "He will send for you in an hour to discuss the household rules." "Rules," I repeated. "Of course there are rules." "There are always rules, signorina. The question is whether one is wise enough to follow them." She moved toward the door, then stopped, her back still to me. "The windows are alarmed, but the bathroom has a small skylight. It opens. I mention this only because honesty, I find, prevents unfortunate accidents." She left before I could respond to what might have been help or might have been a test. With Rosa, I suspected it could be both simultaneously. A woman who'd spent decades in Lorenzo's household would have learned to operate in layers, to say one thing while meaning several others. I approached the tray, my stomach overriding my determination not to accept anything from my captor. The pasta was exquisite, handmade clearly, with a sauce that tasted of cream and mushrooms and something else I couldn't quite identify. The wine was dark red, robust, probably worth more than I'd spent on wine in my entire life. I ate mechanically, tasting nothing despite the obvious quality, my mind racing through options that all led to the same dead end. I could try the skylight Rosa had mentioned. But even if I made it out, I was on a cliff in a foreign country with no money, no passport, and no way to get home. Lorenzo would find me before I made it 10 miles. And then what? The less pleasant security measures he'd mentioned with such casual menace? I could try to contact someone. But who? Iris would be frantic, probably already calling hospitals and police stations. My few other friends were acquaintances, really. People I'd had coffee with but who didn't know me well enough to mount a rescue. I had no family left. My mother had died when I was 8. My father at 19. My grandmother 3 years ago. I was alone in a way that Lorenzo had probably known before I'd fully realized it myself. The hour passed in a haze of useless planning. When the knock came again, I'd changed into clothes from the armoire. Simple black pants and a white blouse that fit perfectly, because of course they did, and steeled myself for whatever came next. Lorenzo stood in the hallway, now dressed more casually in dark pants and a shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. Without his jacket, he looked somehow more dangerous, the powerful build of his shoulders and arms evident in a way the tailoring had masked. "Come," he said. "We have things to discuss." I followed him down the corridor to a study that occupied the villa's corner, with windows on 2 walls that would offer stunning views in daylight. Now they reflected the room's interior back at us. The desk laden with papers and a laptop, the bookshelves filled with volumes in multiple languages, the bar cart in one corner with its array of expensive liquors. Lorenzo gestured to a chair across from his desk, then poured 2 glasses of amber liquid before settling into his own seat. He slid 1 glass across to me. "I don't drink whiskey," I said. "You do tonight. It will make this conversation easier." I took the glass but didn't drink, cradling it between my hands and feeling its warmth. The whiskey smelled of smoke and something sweet, expensive, like everything else in this place. "The rules," Lorenzo began, steepling his fingers before him in a gesture that suggested he'd given this speech before, "are simple. You may move freely within the villa and its grounds. The beach below is accessible via a staircase cut into the cliff. It's private, and you may use it as you wish during daylight hours. After dark, the grounds are patrolled, and you're expected to remain inside." "Patrolled by whom?" "Men who work for me. Security is necessary given my business interests. You needn't concern yourself with them. They have instructions not to interact with you beyond ensuring your safety." "My safety or my compliance?" "Both." He took a sip of his whiskey, his expression unreadable. "You'll take your meals with me unless I'm away on business. Rosa will establish a schedule that accommodates both our needs. You're not expected to cook or clean. Staff handles those tasks. What I do expect is your presence, your conversation, and your company." "Company," I repeated, the word heavy with implications I didn't want to examine. "Not in the way you're imagining." His gaze sharpened. "I want your company as in companionship, someone to dine with, to discuss books and art and the 1,000 small things that make life interesting. I don't require physical intimacy, nor will I force it. That's not the nature of this arrangement." The relief that flooded through me was so intense it made me dizzy. I'd been trying not to think about that possibility, pushing it away every time it surfaced, but it had lurked beneath every interaction like a shark in dark water. "Why?" I asked. "If you don't want that, then what's the point of keeping me here? What does my presence actually give you?" He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. When he spoke, his voice was different, softer, with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name. "My mother left when I was 12, walked out one morning and never came back. My father spent the rest of his life building this empire." He gestured vaguely at the room, the villa, the world beyond, and telling me that loyalty was the only currency that mattered, that contracts were sacred, that a man's word, once given, could never be broken without destroying everything. That's a lot of philosophy for keeping someone prisoner. You're not a prisoner, you're fulfillment of a contract. There's a difference. He leaned forward, and the lamplight cast his features into sharp relief. Your father signed an agreement. He took my money, made promises, and then vanished with both. That betrayal, that broken contract, it represented everything my father taught me to despise. Recovering you, holding you to the terms your father agreed to, it's not about money or revenge. It's about maintaining the principle that contracts matter, that actions have consequences, that the world operates on certain rules, and breaking them has a cost. That's insane. Perhaps. But it's my insanity, and you're living in it now. He finished his whiskey in one swallow, then poured himself another measure. 1 year, Hazel. Give me 1 year of acknowledging that debt exists, that contracts bind, that your father's actions meant something beyond the immediate theft. That's all I'm asking. You're asking for my life. I'm asking for a year of it. The rest remains yours. I stared at him. This man who kidnapped people to prove philosophical points about loyalty and contracts, who kept prisoners in luxury while calling it principle, who'd tracked me for 2 years and chose my wedding day to collect his debt. He was insane. Completely. Absolutely insane. And I had no choice but to play along. Fine, I said, taking a sip of the whiskey and feeling it burn down my throat. 1 year. But I want something in return. His eyebrows rose slightly. You're negotiating? You said you value contracts. Consider this a counteroffer to the terms. A smile ghosted across his lips. What do you want? Access to internet and phone, monitored if you must, but I need to contact my friend Iris. Let her know I'm alive, that I left willingly, that she shouldn't worry. Agreed. Anything else? Books. I saw your library downstairs. I want access to it. Of course. It exists to be used. What else? I thought about it, about what would make this year bearable. What small freedoms I could carve out within these beautiful walls. No lying. If I ask you something directly, you answer honestly. I'll do the same. Honesty, he repeated, testing the word. That's dangerous for both of us. That's my price. He studied me for a long moment, and I met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away first. This was my one chance to establish some kind of ground, to be something other than a passive victim of my father's choices. Agreed, Lorenzo said finally. Honesty. Though I warn you, some truths are more comfortable as mysteries. I'll take my chances. He raised his glass in a mock toast. To honesty, then. And to 1 year of fulfilling contracts. I didn't raise mine, but I took another sip, feeling the whiskey's warmth spread through my chest. Outside the study's windows, the sea continued its eternal rhythm against the cliffs. Inside, I sat across from a man who called himself a monster and proved it through philosophies about loyalty that bordered on madness. 1 year, 365 days. I could survive anything for a year. Couldn't I? The first week passed in a strange suspension of reality. I woke each morning in the enormous bed, disoriented by the sound of waves instead of traffic, by the quality of light through the curtains, golden and soft in ways that city light never managed. Rosa brought breakfast on a tray. Fresh bread, fruit, coffee that tasted like it had been grown specifically for my palate. I ate alone, watching the sea through the windows, and wondered how something so beautiful could feel so much like a cage. Lorenzo appeared for dinner each evening, punctual to the minute. We ate in the formal dining room at a table that could have seated 12, but felt somehow intimate with just the two of us at opposite ends. He asked questions about my work as a translator, about the languages I spoke, French, Italian, some German, and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. I asked nothing in return, maintaining a silence I hoped conveyed my continued resistance. On the 8th day, I broke. Why do you eat dinner with me? I asked, setting down my fork with more force than necessary. You could have your meals brought to your study. You don't need to play at civility. Lorenzo looked up from his pasta. We always had pasta, a different preparation each night, each more exquisite than the last, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. I told you, I value company, conversation. You don't need me for that. You could hire someone, pay them actual money instead of extracting a year of their life. But then I wouldn't have the satisfaction of a contract fulfilled. He took a sip of wine, his eyes never leaving mine. Besides, paid companions tell you what you want to hear. You, on the other hand, seem pathologically incapable of false courtesy. It's refreshing. Glad my captivity is refreshing for you. There it is, that particular acid tone. Rosa says you've been wandering the library during the day, pulling out books and reading them in the garden. She's scandalized that you don't put them back in the proper order. I'm not a librarian. No, you're a translator, which is why I have a proposal. I waited, wary of where this was heading. Lorenzo produced a folder from beneath his napkin. Had it been there all through dinner? And slid it across the table's polished surface. Inside were documents in what looked like Russian, dense paragraphs of Cyrillic text that meant nothing to me at first glance. I have business associates in Moscow, he said. Legitimate business before you ask. Import-export, mostly. These contracts need translation into Italian. My usual translator is unavailable, and I thought you might welcome something to occupy your time beyond antagonizing Rosa's filing system. I stared at the documents, then at him. You want me to work for you? I want to pay you to work. There's a difference. Your presence here satisfies your father's debt, but your labor, your professional skills, those belong to you. I'm offering standard rates for contract translation. We can set up an account in your name. The money will be yours to do with, as you wish. It was manipulation. Obviously, it was manipulation. Give the prisoner a purpose. Make her feel useful. Blur the lines between captor and employer until she forgot which was which. I should refuse on principle, maintain my resistance, not let him think he could buy my cooperation. But the truth was, I was going mad with boredom. The villa was beautiful. The grounds were stunning. But I'd never been someone who could simply exist in luxury. I needed purpose, problems to solve, the particular satisfaction that came from turning one language into another while preserving meaning and nuance. What's the catch? I asked. No catch, though I will need the translations completed within 2 weeks. Can you manage that timeline? I flipped through the documents. Standard commercial contracts, as far as I could tell. Terms of sale, shipping agreements, payment schedules. Nothing obviously criminal, though with Lorenzo, I'd learned to trust nothing at face value. Yes, I said. I can manage it. Excellent. I'll have a desk and laptop set up in your sitting room tomorrow. Rosa will show you where to find any reference materials you need. He returned to his dinner, as if we'd just negotiated something mundane instead of the first crack in the wall between us. That night, I lay in bed and thought about my father. Before he died, when I was 19 and home from my first year of university, I'd found him in his study late one night, staring at spreadsheets with an expression I'd never seen before. Terror. Pure, undiluted terror that turned his face gray. "Papa?" I'd said from the doorway. "What's wrong?" He'd closed the laptop quickly, forcing a smile. "Nothing, Kara, just work stress. Nothing for you to worry about." I'd believed him, hugged him, and gone back to bed, never questioning why an accountant would look so frightened of numbers. 3 weeks later, he was dead. Heart attack, the doctor said. Stress-related. And I'd inherited his apartment, his savings, his life insurance, never knowing that beneath it all was a debt to a man named Lorenzo Conti, and a contract signed with my life as collateral. Had he planned to tell me? Had he spent his last years carrying that secret, knowing what would come when the contract's term expired? Or had he convinced himself that somehow he'd fix it, that he'd find the money, that his daughter would never have to pay for his desperation? I wanted to hate him for it. Some days I did hate him, lying here in luxury that felt like punishment, my freedom bought with his theft. But mostly I just felt sad. Sad for the man who'd raised me alone after my mother died, who'd taught me to love books and languages, who'd worked so hard to give me opportunities he'd never had. Sad that his last years had been consumed by fear. Sad that I'd never know if he'd loved me enough to tell me the truth, or if his silence had been its own form of protection. The moon was full that night, its light streaming through the curtains I'd deliberately left open in small rebellion. I rose and went to the window, looking out at the sea turned silver beneath that ancient light. Far below, I could see a figure standing on the beach. Lorenzo, I realized, his form recognizable even at this distance. He stood perfectly still, hands in his pockets, staring out at the water as if searching for answers in its endless rhythm. Even monsters, it seemed, had sleepless nights. The next morning, I found the desk and laptop exactly where Lorenzo had promised, positioned near the window in my sitting room. The laptop was new, probably purchased specifically for this purpose, and when I opened it, I found translation software already installed, along with access to online dictionaries and reference materials. Efficient. Everything with Lorenzo was efficient. I dove into the work with a relief that bordered on desperation. The Russian was challenging but not impossible. Legal language had its own vocabulary that transcended specific languages, once you learned the patterns. I worked through breakfast, through lunch that Rosa brought on a tray without comment, through the afternoon until my eyes ached and my back complained about the hours hunched over the keyboard. When I finally stopped, the sun was setting, painting the sea in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost aggressive in their beauty. I'd translated 40 pages. At this rate, I'd be done in a week, well ahead of Lorenzo's deadline. You're making excellent progress. I spun in my chair to find Lorenzo standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard him enter. How long had he been watching? "Don't you knock?" I snapped. The door was open. I assumed that was an invitation. He moved into the room, looking at the screen over my shoulder. "Your Italian is flawless. Better than my usual translators, actually." My grandmother was from Milan. She insisted I learn properly, not the tourist version. The grandmother who left you her veil. I felt suddenly exposed, that he knew this detail, that he'd observed enough to notice what I'd brought from the chapel. Yes, that grandmother. She would have despised me, Lorenzo said, and there was something like fondness in his voice. Italian grandmothers have very particular views about proper courtship. Kidnapping the bride on her wedding day would not qualify. This isn't courtship. No, he agreed. It's something else entirely. I'm not sure there's a word for it. He pulled the second chair close to mine. When had that been brought in? And sat, his attention on the screen rather than on me. This close, I could smell his cologne, something with cedar and spice. Expensive without being overpowering. "This clause here?" he said, pointing to a paragraph I'd just translated. "You've written force majeure, but the Russian is more specific. It's excluding political upheaval specifically. The distinction matters." I looked at where he was pointing, then back at the Russian text. He was right. The nuance was subtle, but it changed the meaning in ways that could be significant. "Your Russian is good," I said, grudgingly impressed. "Necessary for business. Though I prefer Italian. It's a language that understands the importance of food and family. Russian is efficient but cold, like its winters." "Have you been to Russia?" "Many times. Moscow mostly, though I've spent time in St. Petersburg as well. Beautiful cities, though the cold is brutal if you're not prepared for it." He leaned back in the chair, and I realized this was the most relaxed I'd seen him, the usual vigilance in his posture slightly loosened. "You'd like St. Petersburg, I think. The museums alone would occupy you for months." "Will I see it? On this year of captivity?" "That depends. If you prove trustworthy, travel isn't out of the question. I have business throughout Europe." "Trustworthy," I repeated, tasting the word's bitter irony. The prisoner earning her captor's trust. The woman fulfilling a contract earning the recognition that she's not a flight risk. Language matters, Hazel. Choose your words carefully. They shape reality more than you know. I wanted to argue, but I was too tired, and he was too close. And some part of me was starting to forget that this man was my enemy. That was the real danger, I realized. Not violence or cruelty, but this, the slow erosion of boundaries, the gradual comfort with captivity, the way he made philosophical debates feel like conversation between equals rather than manipulation. "I should finish this section before dinner," I said, turning back to the screen. "Of course, I'll leave you to it." He stood, then paused. "For what it's worth, your father would be proud of your work. You have his gift for numbers and language both." "Don't," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Don't talk about him like you knew him, like you cared." I didn't care about him. But I did know him, in a way. He was desperate and afraid, and made terrible choices because of it. Those are things I understand intimately. He moved toward the door, then looked back. We're not so different, your father and I. The only distinction is that I've built power from my desperation, while he was destroyed by his. After he left, I sat staring at the screen without seeing it, his words echoing in my head. We're not so different. But they were different. My father had been kind, gentle, incapable of the casual menace that Lorenzo wore like a second skin. Weren't they? Except my father had also stolen millions, had signed a contract using his daughter as collateral, had lied by omission for years. Maybe the difference between them was smaller than I wanted to believe. Maybe desperation turned everyone into monsters, given enough pressure and time. I worked until Rosa knocked, announcing dinner. Lorenzo was already seated when I entered the dining room, reading something on his phone with a frown that suggested bad news. Problem? I asked, taking my seat. He glanced up, seeming surprised by my question. Nothing that concerns you. A business associate making demands he has no right to make. Will you kill him? The bluntness of my question seemed to surprise him further. Then he laughed. A genuine sound that transformed his face into something younger, less burdened. You've been reading too many crime novels in my library. No, I won't kill him. I'll simply make it clear that his demands are unreasonable, and that continuing to press them would be unwise. He poured wine for both of us, the ritual so established now that I didn't protest. Violence is expensive and messy. I prefer negotiation when possible. When possible, I echoed. What about when it's not possible? Then I do what's necessary to protect what's mine. His gaze held mine, and I saw in it the steel beneath the philosophy, the reality beneath the civilized veneer. But I don't enjoy it, if that's what you're asking. I'm not a sadist, Hazel, just a pragmatist. Dinner proceeded in what had become our usual pattern. Excellent food, careful conversation that revealed little. The illusion of normalcy stretched across the reality of my captivity. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the translation work, giving us common ground. Maybe it was exhaustion wearing down my resistance. Or maybe it was simply time, doing what time always did, eroding edges, smoothing sharp corners, making the unbearable gradually bearable. Tell me about your mother, I said, surprising myself with the request. Lorenzo set down his fork slowly, his expression closing like a door. Why? You mentioned she left. I want to know why. Honesty, he said. The word weighted with our agreement. You're invoking our contract. Yes. He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then finally, she left because my father was what I am. Because she couldn't reconcile the man she'd married with the man his business required him to be. One morning, when I was 12, I came down to breakfast and found a note on the kitchen table. I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore. Be better than your father. Nothing else. No explanation, no goodbye, just that note and her absence. Did you ever see her again? No. My father had her tracked to France, then lost the trail in Paris. She became a ghost. Possibly literally. I've never been certain whether she's alive or dead. He picked up his wine, swirling it without drinking. For years I hated her. Then I grew old enough to understand what my father really was, what his business actually entailed. Now I just feel sad that she felt fleeing was her only option. Why didn't you leave? Choose something different. Where would I go? This is my inheritance, Hazel. My father's empire, his contracts, his obligations. Walking away would mean leaving dozens of people unprotected, hundreds of agreements unfulfilled. So I stayed, I learned. I became what was necessary. He finally drank the wine, then met my eyes. We don't always get to choose who we become. Sometimes circumstances choose for us. It should have been a justification, an excuse for the things he'd done. But in his voice, I heard something else. Resignation, acceptance, maybe even regret. This was a man who'd been 12 years old when his mother abandoned him, who'd grown up in a world that demanded hardness, who'd become a monster because the alternative was being destroyed by other monsters. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "Don't be. Sympathy is wasted on the past. Save it for more productive uses." He stood, signaling the end of dinner and the conversation both. "I have work to finish tonight. I'll see you tomorrow." I watched him leave. This man who was my captor and my employer, my enemy, and increasingly something I couldn't quite name. And I thought about my father's note from that morning I'd found him in his study. "Nothing for you to worry about." And Lorenzo's mother's note, "Be better than your father." And how both of them had failed at the one thing they'd tried to do. Protect the people they loved from the consequences of their choices. That night, I dreamed of pearl buttons and contracts signed in blood, of my father's signature transforming into my own, of Lorenzo's hands unbuttoning not my wedding gown but something deeper, something I couldn't name. I woke gasping, the moonlight streaming through my windows, and understood with horrible clarity that the real danger wasn't captivity. It was the slow realization that I was starting to understand my captor, and worse, starting to care. 3 months passed in that strange suspended reality. I finished the Russian translations ahead of schedule, and Lorenzo immediately provided more work, contracts in French, correspondence in German, even some legal documents in Spanish that required specialized knowledge I had to research. The money accumulated in an account he'd set up, numbers that represented freedom I couldn't yet access, but that nevertheless felt like a kind of power. The routine became familiar. Morning work in my sitting room, lunch on the terrace overlooking the sea, afternoon walks through the gardens where Rosa had grudgingly begun to tolerate my presence, dinners with Lorenzo, where our conversations had evolved from careful formality to something approaching genuine exchange. He told me about his business, the legitimate parts at least, and I found myself interested despite my determination not to be. "You're good at this," I said one evening in late July, after he'd finished explaining a particularly complex deal involving shipping routes and customs regulations. "If you'd wanted, you could have been entirely legitimate. Why didn't you?" "Legacy," he said simply. "My father's empire was built on less savory foundations. You can't simply walk away from those obligations without consequences. People depend on the services we provide, protection, access, solutions to problems the law can't or won't address. Abandoning them would mean leaving them vulnerable. So, you're a criminal because people need you to be. I'm a criminal because the world isn't as simple as legal and illegal. There's a vast gray area where most of life actually happens, and someone needs to operate there." He poured more wine, his movements relaxed in a way they never were during daylight hours. "You think I'm rationalizing. Perhaps I am. But the people I've helped over the years, the families I've protected, the small businesses I've kept from being crushed by larger predators, they don't care about the moral ambiguity of my methods." I couldn't argue with that, much as I wanted to. The truth was more complicated than I'd believed when I'd first stepped into his car, more nuanced than the simple categories of good and evil I'd tried to maintain. "Why me?" I asked, the question I'd been circling for months finally emerging. "You could have collected the debt in other ways. Money, property, whatever my father took. Why insist on this year of my life?" Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the candles burning between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "Because money is meaningless. I have more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Property is just things. What your father took wasn't really the money. It was the principle that contracts matter, that agreements bind, that a man's word means something. He looked up, meeting my eyes. You're not here to repay the debt. You're here as proof that contracts have meaning, that someone somewhere still believes in honor and obligation, even if it's enforced rather than voluntary. That's insane. Yes, he agreed, but it's my insanity, and it keeps a certain order in my world. Without it, everything collapses into chaos. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed with the particular urgency that meant business couldn't wait. He glanced at it, his expression hardening instantly. I need to take this, he said, standing. We'll continue this conversation another time. He disappeared into his study, and I sat alone at the table, Rosa appearing from nowhere to clear the plates with her usual silent efficiency. Through the study's closed door, I could hear Lorenzo's voice, sharp with anger or command. It was hard to tell which. Something was wrong. Even from here, I could sense the change in atmosphere, the way the villa itself seemed to hold its breath. An hour later, Lorenzo emerged, his face a mask of controlled fury. Pack a bag, he said. We're leaving in 30 minutes. What? Where? Venice. There's a situation that requires my immediate attention. His gaze swept over me, assessing. You're coming with me. It's not safe to leave you here right now. Not safe from whom? People who might think taking you would give them leverage over me. I won't risk it. He was already moving toward the stairs. Pack for 3 days. Formal clothes. We'll be attending some business functions. Rosa will help you. 25 minutes later, I sat in the back of a car beside Lorenzo, my hastily packed bag in the trunk, watching the villa disappear behind us. Felix drove with the same efficient calm he'd shown on that first journey, but the 2 additional cars following us, filled with men I'd glimpsed around the property but never spoken to, suggested this was more serious than Lorenzo was letting on. What's happening? I asked as we joined the highway heading north. A business associate has forgotten the terms of our arrangement. I need to remind him. Lorenzo's jaw was tight, his usual careful control fraying at the edges. He's holding a dinner party in Venice tomorrow night. I'll be attending. You'll be with me. As what? Your translator? Your prisoner on display? As my companion. As proof that I'm not isolated, not vulnerable, not someone to be tested. He turned to look at me, and I saw in his eyes something I'd never seen before. Genuine concern. Not for himself, but for me. I know this isn't what we agreed to, but circumstances have changed. I need you visible, beside me, demonstrably under my protection. Can you do that? Do I have a choice? There's always a choice, Hazel. But some choices have consequences worse than others. We drove through the night, stopping only once for fuel and coffee. Lorenzo made call after call, mostly in Italian, too rapid for me to follow completely, though I caught words that suggested money, territory, and violence held barely in check. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough to pull him from his carefully controlled world at the villa into something more dangerous. Dawn found us approaching Venice, the city rising from the lagoon like something from a dream. We didn't enter the historic center, but instead stopped at a hotel on the mainland, modern, expensive, anonymous. Felix and the other men checked us in with military precision, while Lorenzo guided me to a suite on the top floor. Rest, he ordered, his voice allowing no argument. We have the dinner tonight. I need you sharp. Lorenzo? Please, Hazel. For once, just trust me. I'll explain everything I can later. But right now, I need you safe, and I need you rested. Can you give me that? The vulnerability in his voice was so unexpected that I found myself nodding. He touched my cheek, briefly, a gesture that felt both protective and possessive, then left, the door closing with a soft click. I stood in the center of the hotel room, smaller than my rooms at the villa, but still luxurious, and felt the full weight of how much had changed in 3 months. I should have been planning escape, should have been looking for opportunities to contact someone, to get help, to end this forced captivity. Instead, I was worrying about Lorenzo, wondering what threat had emerged that made him look so concerned, wanting to help him navigate whatever crisis was unfolding. When had I stopped being his captive and become something else? The question haunted me as I showered, as I tried unsuccessfully to sleep, as I finally gave up and stood by the window watching the city wake. Somewhere out there, someone had threatened Lorenzo's carefully maintained order, and he'd brought me along not as a prisoner, but as protection. Mine or his, I wasn't entirely sure. At 6 p.m, Rosa appeared at my door. When had she arrived? Carrying a garment bag and makeup case. She worked in silent efficiency, transforming me into someone I barely recognized. The dress was deep emerald green, silk that clung and flowed in ways that suggested serious money. My dark hair was arranged in an elegant updo, my makeup subtle but flawless. When she finished, I looked like I belonged at the kind of dinner party where deals were made and fates were decided. "You look beautiful, signorina," Rosa said, and there was something almost like approval in her eyes. Lorenzo appeared moments later, devastating in a black tuxedo that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the silver at his temples. He stopped when he saw me, something flickering across his face that might have been surprise or admiration, or something deeper he immediately suppressed. "Perfect," he said softly. "You look perfect." The dinner party was held at a palazzo on the Grand Canal, accessed by private water taxi that glided through the evening light. Other boats arrived simultaneously, disgorging couples and groups dressed in formal wear that probably cost more than most people earned in months. I recognized no one, but the way people looked at Lorenzo, with deference mixed with wariness, told me everything I needed to know about his standing in this world. Inside, the palazzo was stunning. Frescoed ceilings, marble floors, artwork that belonged in museums. Waiters circulated with champagne and small, exquisite foods. A string quartet played in one corner, their music mixing with conversation in multiple languages. This was power's natural habitat, wealth so comfortable with itself, it didn't need to announce its presence. Lorenzo's hand settled at the small of my back, proprietary and protective simultaneously. He guided me through the crowd, stopping occasionally to greet people with careful courtesy. I noticed he introduced me by name, but never explained our relationship, letting people make their own assumptions about who I was and why I was there. "That's Giulio Bianchi," Lorenzo murmured as we approached a silver-haired man holding court near the windows. "He's our host, the business associate I mentioned. Watch him carefully. Notice how he positions himself, who he allows into his circle." I watched as Lorenzo had instructed. Giulio was smaller than I expected, perhaps 60, with soft hands and careful gestures. But there was something in his eyes, a calculation, a coldness, that suggested the soft exterior was carefully cultivated camouflage. "Lorenzo," Giulio said, turning as we approached. "How good of you to come, and you've brought a companion. How delightful." "Giulio, thank you for the invitation." Lorenzo's tone was perfectly cordial, but I felt the tension in his body, the way his hand at my back tensed almost imperceptibly. "This is Hazel. Hazel, Giulio Bianchi, an old business associate." "Charmed," Giulio said, taking my hand and bringing it to his lips in a gesture that managed to be courtly and somehow threatening. "Lorenzo, I wasn't aware you were seeing anyone. You've been quite secretive. I value privacy in my personal life." Of course. Though in our world, privacy can sometimes be complicated. One's associates do like to know about significant relationships. For security purposes, you understand. The words were pleasant, but the meaning beneath them was clear. You've introduced an unknown variable, and that makes me nervous. Hazel is perfectly secure, Lorenzo replied. You need have no concerns on that front. I'm certain you're right. Still, one does wonder about her background, her family, her loyalties. This was a test, I realized. Giulio was pushing, seeing how Lorenzo would respond, how much value he placed on me, whether I represented vulnerability or strength. My background, I said, my voice clear and calm despite my racing heart, is entirely ordinary. My loyalties are my own business. But since we're at a party, perhaps we could discuss something more pleasant than interrogating guests about their security clearances. Silence fell across the small group that had gathered to watch this exchange. Lorenzo's hand tightened on my back, though whether in warning or approval I couldn't tell. Giulio's eyes narrowed slightly, then he laughed, breaking the tension. Spirit, I like that. Lorenzo, you've chosen well. A woman who can hold her own in conversation is rare in our circles. He raised his champagne glass. To new acquaintances and old friendships. As we moved away, Lorenzo leaned close, his lips near my ear. That was either very brave or very foolish. I haven't decided which. He was testing you through me. I wasn't going to play the demure companion. No, Lorenzo agreed, and I heard something like pride in his voice. You certainly weren't. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of faces and conversations, all conducted with the careful politeness that characterized interactions between predators. I stayed close to Lorenzo, playing the role he needed me to play while watching everything, learning the patterns of power and deference that governed this world. It was exhausting and fascinating in equal measure. We left near midnight, Lorenzo's hand still at my back as he guided me to the waiting boat. Once we were alone on the water, the palazzo receding behind us, he finally exhaled, some of the tension draining from his shoulders. You did well tonight, he said. Better than I could have hoped. What was the point of all that? The power display? Giulio has been suggesting that my operation has become vulnerable, that I'm isolated, distracted, not paying sufficient attention to business. Tonight was about demonstrating the opposite, that I'm secure enough to bring someone into my life, that I have support, that reports of my distraction are greatly exaggerated. So I was a prop, a demonstration of your strength. You were proof that I'm not alone. He turned to look at me, the lights from passing buildings casting shadows across his face. In our world, perceived weakness is actual weakness. Giulio was testing whether you represented vulnerability. You proved you didn't. That matters more than you know. Back at the hotel, Lorenzo walked me to my room but didn't enter. He stood in the doorway, and in the dim hallway light, he looked suddenly tired, the weight of whatever he carried showing through his usual control. Thank you, he said simply. For tonight, for not fighting me, for playing your part. I know this isn't what you signed up for. I didn't sign up for any of this. No, your father did that for you. He reached out, his hand cupping my cheek in a gesture that felt intimate despite its brevity. But you're handling it with more grace than I would have in your position. Grace or resignation? Does it matter? Both are forms of strength. He left, and I stood alone in my room, touching the spot where his hand had been, feeling the warmth that lingered there. 3 months ago, I would have recoiled from his touch. Now I found myself wishing he'd stayed, that we'd continued talking, that the evening didn't have to end with me alone and him retreating to whatever burdens waited in his own room. This was the real danger. Not violence or cruelty, but this slow erosion of boundaries, this gradual shift from captive to companion, this treacherous thing that was starting to feel dangerously like care. I was falling, and I had no idea how to stop. August arrived with heat that turned the villa into a sun-drenched sanctuary. I'd been with Lorenzo for nearly 5 months now, and the woman who'd arrived in a wedding gown seemed like someone from another lifetime. I worked through the mornings, translating documents that I'd learned to read with new understanding, seeing beneath the legal language to the networks of obligation and protection that formed the skeleton of Lorenzo's empire. He was gone more frequently now, traveling to Milan, to Rome, to places he didn't name. But he always returned, and I'd learned to recognize the signs of his arrival, the change in the household's rhythm, the way Rosa moved with renewed purpose, the particular quality of silence that preceded his footsteps in the hall. "You're becoming comfortable here," he observed one evening over dinner. We'd moved from the formal dining room to the terrace as summer deepened, eating while the sun set over the sea in shades of amber and rose. Comfortable is the wrong word. Accustomed, perhaps. What's the difference? Comfortable suggests contentment. Accustomed just means I've adapted to circumstances beyond my control. I set down my fork, meeting his gaze across the table. It's survival, Lorenzo, not acceptance. And yet you smile more now, I've noticed. When you're working, when Rosa makes some cutting remark you think I don't hear, even sometimes when we talk like this. He was right, though I hated admitting it. The sharp edges of my anger had worn down over months of routine and careful conversations, replaced by something more complex. Not forgiveness, I wasn't capable of that yet, but a kind of understanding that made simple hatred impossible. "You're less terrible than I expected," I said, the admission feeling like surrender. "That doesn't make this right." "No," he agreed, "but it makes it bearable. For both of us." His phone buzzed, and his expression shifted as he read the message. The warmth that had been building between us cooled instantly, replaced by the careful control I recognized as his armor against the world. "I need to go away for a few days," he said, standing. "Felix will stay. The security team will be doubled. You're not to leave the grounds." "What's happened?" "Nothing that concerns you." But the tightness in his jaw suggested otherwise. "Promise me you'll stay inside." "Lorenzo." "Promise me, Hazel." His voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before. "Whatever you think of me, of this arrangement, promise me you won't do anything foolish while I'm gone." The fear in his eyes was genuine. That more than anything made me nod. "I promise." He left that night, the villa feeling strangely empty without his presence. I worked through the next day, trying to ignore the increased number of security personnel I glimpsed through the windows, the way Felix seemed perpetually on edge, the tension that radiated from every corner of the house. On the second day, Rosa found me in the library, her usual stern expression replaced by something that looked almost like concern. "Signorina," she said, "you should know. The situation with Signor Bianchi has escalated. There are people who would use you to hurt Signor Conti. The security is not just precaution." "Use me how?" She shook her head. "It's better you don't know the details. But Signor Conti cares for you more than is wise in his position. That makes you valuable to his enemies. He doesn't care for me. I'm fulfillment of a contract." Rosa's laugh was surprisingly bitter. "You believe that? Then you're more blind than I thought. The man I've served for 20 years has never looked at anyone the way he looks at you. Never brought anyone to this house, his private sanctuary. Never worried about anyone's safety above his own interests." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Be careful, Signorina. Hearts are more dangerous than contracts in our world." I spent the rest of that day thinking about her words, about the way Lorenzo's hand would linger at my back, about the conversations that had evolved from hostile to companionable, to something I couldn't quite name, about the moment in Venice when he'd cupped my face with such tenderness, I'd felt it like a physical ache. Was Rosa right? Had something shifted between us from captor and captive to something more complicated? Lorenzo returned on the third day, and I knew immediately that something terrible had happened. His face was drawn, a bruise darkening his jaw. his movements careful in a way that suggested pain he was trying to hide. "You're hurt," I said, meeting him in the entrance hall before Rosa could intercept. "It's nothing." But he swayed slightly, and I saw blood seeping through his shirt sleeve. "That's not nothing! Rosa!" I called, already moving toward him. "Get the first aid supplies. Now." He tried to protest as I guided him to his study, but the fight had gone out of him. Whatever had happened had taken more from him than just physical injury. I pushed him into a chair and began unbuttoning his shirt with hands that trembled despite my attempt at calm. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "Be quiet." The shirt came away to reveal a gash along his ribs. Not deep, but angry and still bleeding. Rosa appeared with supplies, then wisely retreated, leaving us alone. I cleaned the wound with careful attention, feeling him tense beneath my touch, but not pulling away. "What happened?" I asked. Giulio decided to test whether I was serious about protecting my interests. He was wrong. Lorenzo's voice was flat, emotionless in the way that suggested deep feeling held rigidly in check. "He won't test again." "Did you kill him?" "No. But he understands now that there are consequences to threatening what's mine." I paused in my work, antiseptic-soaked gauze hovering over his skin. "What's yours?" "You." The word hung between us, weighted with meaning I wasn't sure I wanted to examine. "He sent men to the villa while I was away. Felix stopped them, but it was close. Too close. If you'd been outside, if security had been less vigilant." He broke off, jaw clenching. "I won't let that happen again." "Lorenzo, I'm not actually yours. I'm here because of a contract, a debt, not because—" "Stop." His hand caught mine, stilling my movements. "Stop hiding behind the contract. We both know this stopped being about your father's debt months ago." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Then what is it about?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It's about the fact that for the first time since my mother left, I don't feel alone. It's about conversations that make me forget the weight of everything I carry. It's about seeing you smile when you solve a particularly difficult translation and feeling something I thought I'd lost the capacity for." His eyes met mine, and the vulnerability in them stole my breath. "It's about caring for someone in ways that make me weak, that give my enemies weapons to use against me, and not being able to bring myself to regret it." I should have pulled away, should have reminded him about power dynamics and captivity, and all the reasons why anything between us was impossible. But I couldn't make myself move, couldn't tear my gaze from his, couldn't deny the truth I'd been avoiding for months. "This is insane," I whispered. "Yes." His hand came up to cup my face, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone. "But insanity seems to be my natural state. The contract still stands. I'm still here against my will." "Are you?" The question was gentle, without accusation. "If I told you right now that you could leave, that the debt was forgiven, that you were free, what would you do?" I opened my mouth to say I'd leave immediately, that I'd never look back, that freedom was all I'd wanted since that moment in the chapel. But the words wouldn't come, because the truth was more complicated than simple captivity and escape. The truth was that somewhere in the past 5 months, this beautiful prison had become something else entirely. "I don't know," I admitted. "Then stay. Not because of contracts or debts or obligations. Stay because you choose to. Stay because these conversations matter to you the way they matter to me. Stay because—" He broke off, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come easily. "Stay because you want to." "For how long?" "As long as you wish. The year stipulated in the contract is irrelevant. You're free to go at any time. You've been free for months, if you'd only realized it." The revelation should have brought relief, should have made me angry that he'd let me believe I was trapped when I wasn't. Instead, I felt only a strange sadness, because being free to go meant having to make a choice I wasn't ready to face. "You're bleeding through the bandage," I said, returning my attention to the wound because it was easier than looking at his face. "Hold still." I finished dressing the cut in silence, my hands steady despite the turmoil in my chest. When I was done, Lorenzo caught my wrist, his grip gentle but insistent. "Hazel, look at me." I did, and found in his eyes the same confusion and longing I felt churning inside me. "I'm not asking for an answer now," he said. "I'm simply telling you the truth. The door has been unlocked for months. The only cage is the one we've both been pretending exists." He left then, moving carefully because of the injury, leaving me alone with supplies scattered across his desk and the weight of impossible choices pressing down on my shoulders. That night, I stood at my window, looking out at the sea and thinking about freedom. True freedom, not the illusion I'd been clinging to. The freedom to choose, even if the choice was complicated, even if it was foolish, even if it meant staying in a place I'd once called a prison, because somewhere along the way it had become something else. The next morning, I found Lorenzo in the garden, sitting on the stone bench near the jasmine where I'd spent so many afternoons reading. He looked up as I approached, wariness and hope warring in his expression. "Your contract with my father," I said, sitting beside him. "Do you still have it?" "Yes. Why?" "I want to see it again." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through files until he found what he was looking for. The scanned document appeared, my father's signature stark at the bottom. I studied it for a long moment, this piece of paper that had dictated so much of both our lives. "Burn it," I said. "What?" "Burn it. The original, this copy, all of it. I don't want this between us anymore." Lorenzo's expression was unreadable. And then what? What would be between us? "I don't know, but I'd like to find out." I turned to face him fully. "Not as your captive, not as fulfillment of my father's debt, just as Hazel and Lorenzo. Two people trying to figure out what this is. You're choosing to stay. I'm choosing to see what happens if I do. There's a difference." He smiled then, genuine and unguarded, and it transformed his face into something almost beautiful. "I'll take it. There are conditions." "Of course there are. You stop making decisions for me. No more security teams I don't know about. No more controlling where I go or what I do. If I'm staying, it's as an equal, not a possession." "Agreed. What else?" "Honesty. Complete honesty. No more half-truths or omissions. I need to know exactly who you are and what you do. All of it." His expression sobered. "Some truths are dangerous, Hazel. The less you know about certain aspects of my business. I'm either all in or I'm gone. You don't get to protect me from reality while claiming we're equals." He considered this, and I saw the moment he made his decision. "All right, complete honesty. Though I warn you, you may not like everything you learn. Probably not. But I'd rather know the truth than live with comfortable lies." We sat in silence for a while, the morning sun warming the garden around us, the scent of jasmine heavy in the air. This should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, like the moment before jumping, when you're not entirely sure there's water below. "The contract," Lorenzo said finally. "I'll have Felix bring the original from the safe deposit box. We'll burn it together. And then? Then we see what happens when two people choose each other without obligation or debt, when it's just us." "Just us," I repeated, testing the words. "That's terrifying." "Yes," he agreed, "but possibly worth the fear." That evening, we stood in the garden as the sun set, a metal waste bin between us. Lorenzo held the contract, the original, retrieved from Geneva that afternoon, and looked at it for a long moment. This document shaped 5 months of both our lives, he said. Brought you here. Forced proximity that became something neither of us expected. Part of me wonders if burning it is wise. Cold feet? Reasonable hesitation. Once this is gone, we're starting fresh. No excuses, no predetermined endpoint. Just whatever we build from here. Isn't that better than being bound by my father's mistakes? It should be. But it's also more frightening. Obligations are comfortable in their predictability. Choice is messier. I took the paper from his hand, our fingers brushing. Then let's be brave enough for messy. I held the corner of the contract to the small flame Lorenzo produced, watching as fire caught and spread. The paper blackened and curled, my father's signature disappearing into ash. Lorenzo's hand found mine, our fingers interlacing as we watched 5 months of captivity and obligation transform into smoke that rose toward the darkening sky. When it was gone, when nothing remained but ashes, Lorenzo turned to me. So now what? Now, I said, you take me to dinner. Not in the villa where Rosa watches with disapproval. Out, in the world, like 2 people on a date instead of captor and captive. A date, he repeated, and something like wonder crossed his face. I don't think I've been on an actual date in 20 years. Then it's long overdue. We drove to a small restaurant in a village 10 minutes from the villa, a place where everyone clearly knew Lorenzo, but respected his privacy enough not to stare. We ate pasta and drank wine and talked about everything and nothing. Books we'd read, places we'd traveled, the small absurdities of daily life that had nothing to do with contracts or obligations or the weight of empires. It felt normal, beautifully, impossibly normal. Walking back to the car, Lorenzo's hand found mine, and I let it stay there, our fingers interlaced. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of the sea and wild rosemary that grew along the roadside. Hazel, he said, stopping under a streetlight that cast us both in amber light. I need to tell you something. More honesty? Yes. He turned to face me fully, his expression serious. What's developing between us? It puts you at risk. My enemies will see you as leverage. Tonight proved that. Choosing to stay, choosing me, means accepting that danger. I know. Do you? Because it's not theoretical. Giulio's attempt was just the beginning. There are others who would use you to hurt me, who would take you to force my hand, who would... He broke off, jaw clenching. I can protect you, but I can't guarantee safety. Not completely. Lorenzo. I stepped closer, close enough to feel his warmth. I survived 5 months believing I was your prisoner. I think I can survive being something more by choice. That's not the same thing. No, it's better. Because now I know what I'm choosing, and I'm choosing it anyway. He studied my face in the lamplight, looking for doubt or fear. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he leaned down, slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted. I didn't want to. His lips met mine gently, a question more than a demand. I answered by pressing closer, my hands finding their way to his shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him beneath expensive fabric. The kiss deepened, became something that tasted of wine and want, and the strange alchemy of 2 people finding connection in the most unlikely circumstances. When we finally pulled apart, both breathing harder, Lorenzo rested his forehead against mine. I'm falling for you, he whispered. Have been for months, possibly since you stood in that dressing room and promised to gut me with a pearl button if I didn't stop unbuttoning your dress. I laughed despite myself. I never said that. Your eyes did, very clearly. And you fell for me anyway? Especially because of that. You were terrified and angry and completely defiant all at once. It was magnificent. We drove back to the villa in comfortable silence, his hand resting on my knee, my head leaned against the window watching the familiar landscape pass. When we arrived, Rosa was waiting with her usual disapproval. "You're late," she said. "Dinner's at 8. "We ate in the village," Lorenzo replied, utterly unrepentant. "Thank you for your concern, Rosa. We'll manage from here." She harumphed but retreated, and I could have sworn I saw the ghost of a smile on her severe face. "She's warming to me," I said. "She's been warm to you for months. She just expresses it through criticism." In the villa's entrance hall, Lorenzo pulled me close again, this kiss slower, deeper, weighted with months of tension finally released. When we separated, we were both flushed, hearts racing. "Stay with me tonight," he said. "Just sleep. Just company. I don't want to be alone." The vulnerability in the request undid me. Okay. His bedroom was at the villa's opposite end from mine, larger, with windows that overlooked the sea. We undressed separately, carefully, before climbing into a bed that could have fit 4. He drew me against his chest, my back to his front, his arm draped over my waist. "Tell me about your father," he said softly. "Not the man who stole from me. The father you knew." So I did. I told him about Sunday morning pancakes and the way my father would sneak extra chocolate chips when my mother wasn't looking. About his patient explanations of mathematics that had seemed like magic to my child's mind. About the year after my mother died, when grief had hollowed him out, but he'd still shown up every day, making breakfast and helping with homework and pretending to be okay for my sake. "He sounds like a good man who made terrible choices," Lorenzo said when I finished. He was. He did. I turned in his arms to face him. "Like someone else I know, I've made far more terrible choices than your father, Hazel. Don't romanticize me." "I'm not. I see exactly who you are. That's why I'm here." He kissed me then, soft and searching, and I felt something shift between us. The last barrier falling, the final resistance crumbling. This was no longer about contracts or debts or obligation. This was about two people finding connection in the wreckage of circumstances neither had chosen. We fell asleep tangled together, the sound of waves against the cliffs mixing with our breathing, the moonlight painting silver patterns across the floor. And for the first time since that day in the chapel, I felt something like peace. I was choosing this. Choosing him. Choosing us. Whatever came next, it would be my decision. September brought a change in the air. Subtle but undeniable. The first whisper of autumn that would eventually cool the summer heat. I'd been at the villa for 7 months now, though the word "at" felt wrong. I wasn't at the villa. I lived there. With Lorenzo. As his, what? Partner seemed too simple. Girlfriend too juvenile for what we'd become to each other. We'd settled into new rhythms. I still worked in my sitting room, but often Lorenzo would join me, bringing his own laptop and working in companionable silence beside me. We explored the coastline on weekends, venturing to small villages where he was known, but not stared at, where we could walk hand in hand like any normal couple. We read together in the evenings, debating books with a passion that sometimes led to arguments that ended in kisses. It felt like building something real from the ashes of what we'd been. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. I was in Lorenzo's study, searching for a reference book he'd mentioned, when I found it. A small leather journal wedged behind the heavier volumes on the bottom shelf. It fell open as I picked it up, revealing pages covered in cramped handwriting I recognized instantly. My father's handwriting. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, reading entries that dated back 12 years. Transaction details, account numbers, careful notations about money moved through various channels. And near the end, one entry that made my blood run cold. Final insurance. HLD wrist. Tell Hazel when she's ready. May God forgive me for using my daughter this way. H.L. D. Hazel Louise Dubois. My full name, the one only my father had used. Wrist. I pulled back the sleeve of my blouse, staring at the delicate floral tattoo I'd gotten on my 20th birthday. A gift to myself, a small rebellion against grief. The design curved around my wrist, tiny flowers intertwined with what I'd always thought were decorative flourishes. But now, reading my father's entry, I saw them differently. The curves weren't decorative. They were numbers. Coordinates, perhaps, or account information, disguised as art. My father had tattooed the location of Lorenzo's money onto my skin. The journal slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor. I stood frozen, pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. My father's insistence that I get a tattoo for my birthday. His suggestion of that particular design. His death 3 weeks later. Had it really been a heart attack, or had someone found him first? The insurance money that had appeared, exactly enough for college, but nothing extraordinary. As if he'd calculated to the dollar what I'd need to survive without drawing attention. He'd known he was going to die. He'd prepared for it. And he'd left the stolen money's location encoded on my body, where no one would think to look. Hazel? I spun to find Lorenzo in the doorway, his expression shifting from concern to understanding as he took in the open journal at my feet, my pulled-back sleeve, the horror on my face. You knew, I whispered. How long have you known? Hazel. How long, Lorenzo? My voice broke on his name. He moved into the room slowly, as if approaching something that might bolt. 4 months. I noticed the tattoo in July. The pattern was too precise to be random. I had experts analyze photographs, and they confirmed what I suspected. 4 months. He'd known for 4 months that I carried the answer to where his money was hidden, and he'd said nothing. Had kept seducing me, drawing me closer, making me believe this was real between us. Was any of it true? I asked, backing away as he approached. Or was this all just another contract? Get close to me, gain my trust, wait for the right moment to claim what you're really after? Don't. His voice was sharp. Don't reduce what's between us to that. Then what am I supposed to think? You knew I had this information and you didn't tell me. You let me believe. I couldn't finish. The betrayal too raw. I didn't tell you because I didn't care about the money anymore. The admission burst from him with surprising force. By the time I confirmed what the tattoo was, I was already in too deep with you. The money stopped mattering. You mattered. Us mattered. That's convenient. It's true. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration and something like desperation crossing his face. If I wanted the money, I could have taken you to a bank at any point in the past 4 months. Could have forced you to access whatever accounts those numbers reference. I didn't because I don't care about the money, Hazel. I care about you. But you still didn't tell me. You let me walk around with this information tattooed on my skin, never knowing what it meant. That's still a lie. Still a betrayal of the honesty we promised each other. He had no answer to that, because we both knew I was right. I bent to pick up the journal, clutching it to my chest like a shield. I need time to think. Alone. Hazel, please. Alone, Lorenzo. He nodded slowly, his face carefully blank in the way that meant he was feeling too much to show any of it. He left, and I was alone in his study, my father's journal in my hands and the truth of my situation finally, completely clear. I'd been the key to Lorenzo's stolen fortune all along, and I'd never known. That night, I barely slept. I sat at my window, watching the moonlight on the water and thinking about trust and betrayal and the fine line between them. Lorenzo had kept a secret, but he'd also chosen, day after day for 4 months, not to use the information he possessed. Had chosen me over the money that had started all of this. Wasn't that worth something? By dawn, I'd made a decision. I found Lorenzo in the kitchen, making coffee with the careful movements of someone who hadn't slept either. He looked up as I entered, hope and resignation warring in his expression. "We're going to Switzerland," I said. He stared at me. "What?" "The numbers on my wrist. They're Swiss bank account information, aren't they? Coordinates for a safe deposit box, maybe. Whatever my father hid, it's there." I set the journal on the counter between us. "We're going to get it, together, and then we're going to decide what happens next." "Hazel, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do. This has been hanging over both of us since before we met. It's time to end it. All of it." We flew to Zurich 2 days later, just Lorenzo and me and Felix, who drove us from the airport to a discreet bank in the financial district. The account numbers from my wrist, decoded by a cryptographer Lorenzo trusted, led us to a private vault room where a bank officer produced a single safe deposit box and left us alone. Lorenzo looked at me. "Are you sure about this? Open it." Inside was a single USB drive and a letter addressed to me in my father's handwriting. I picked up the letter with shaking hands, leaving Lorenzo to examine the drive. "My dearest Hazel, if you're reading this, then my sins have finally caught up with me, and you found yourself paying for choices I made out of desperation and fear. I cannot apologize enough for putting you in this position. The money I took was never meant to be stolen. I had intended to borrow it, to use it to clear gambling debts that would have destroyed our family. But things spiraled. The more I took, the more I needed to take to cover my tracks. By the time I realized how deep I'd gone, there was no way back. The USB drive contains access to accounts holding approximately 3 million euros, the original amount I took from Lorenzo Conti, minus what I'd already spent trying to buy time. I've tried to make it whole, though I know money can never truly repay what I've stolen. I tattooed those numbers on your wrist because I knew no one would think to look there. I told myself it was insurance, protection for you if anything happened to me. But the truth is simpler and more shameful. I was a coward. I couldn't face the consequences of my actions, so I made them your burden instead. If Lorenzo Conti is reading this, and I imagine he is, please know that my daughter is innocent in this. Whatever debt I owe, let it end with me. Hazel deserves a life free from the shadows of my failures. And Hazel, my beloved girl, forgive me. Forgive me for being weak when I should have been strong. Forgive me for leaving you with this burden. But most of all, forgive me for never being brave enough to tell you the truth while I was alive. You were always braver than me. I pray you'll be brave enough to survive what I've done. Your loving father." I read the letter twice, tears streaming down my face. Lorenzo stood silently beside me, giving me space to process what felt like a final conversation with a man 7 years dead. "He knew," I finally said. "He knew what this would do to me, to us. He was trying to protect you the only way he knew how. By making me the keeper of stolen money I didn't know I carried." I laughed, bitter and broken. "That's not protection, Lorenzo. That's cowardice." "Yes." His hand found my shoulder, a gentle anchor, but it was cowardice born of love, twisted and misguided, but love nonetheless. I turned to him, this man I'd hated and feared and gradually impossibly come to love. "The money. Take it. That's what this was always about, right? The debt is settled." "I don't want it." "Lorenzo." "I don't want it," he repeated firmly. "The money stopped mattering months ago. You matter. What we're building matters. This," he gestured at the USB drive, "this is just numbers. It doesn't change anything between us." "It changes everything. It means you were right from the beginning. My father did owe you. This debt was real, which means our entire relationship has been built on you collecting what was yours." "No." He cupped my face in his hands, forcing me to meet his gaze. Our relationship was built on proximity forced by circumstances. But what it became, that was choice. Yours and mine. This money, this debt, it's the past. I want a future. With you, if you'll still have me. Why? The question burst out of me. Why me? You could have anyone. Why choose someone who came with so much complication? Because you're brave enough to stand in a dressing room and promise violence over pearl buttons. Because you argue about books with passion that makes me forget everything else. Because you saw the monster I am, and chose to stay anyway. His thumb brushed away my tears. Because I love you, Hazel. And I don't care if it started because of a contract or a debt or your father's mistakes. What matters is what we choose now. You love me, I repeated, testing the words. Desperately, completely. In ways that terrify me. He smiled, shaky but genuine. I'm a man who's built his life on control, and you've destroyed every bit of it. I kissed him then, hard and fierce, pouring into it all the confusion and anger and love that churned inside me. His arms came around me, holding me close, and I felt the truth of what he'd said. This had started as a contract, as obligation, as repayment of a debt neither of us had chosen. But what it had become was something else entirely. When we finally pulled apart, I looked at the USB drive sitting innocuously on the vault table. So what do we do with it? Whatever you want. It's technically yours now. Your inheritance from your father. However twisted the delivery method, I thought about it. 3 million euros. Enough to start over anywhere in the world. Enough to walk away from Lorenzo, from the villa, from everything we'd built. Enough to be truly free. Donate it, I said. Find organizations that help people with gambling addictions. Use it to prevent other families from being destroyed the way mine was. You're certain? I don't want money I can't spend without thinking of how it was obtained. I don't want my father's guilt attached to my future. I picked up the drive, holding it out to him. Besides, I have everything I need. He took the drive, then set it aside to pull me close again. I don't deserve you. Probably not, but you're stuck with me now. We left the bank hand in hand. The weight of 7 months of history finally settled. The debt was paid. The contract was void. What remained was choice. His and mine, made freely, made knowing exactly what we were choosing. That evening, back at the villa, Lorenzo had Felix build a fire in the garden fire pit. We sat together on the stone bench, his arm around my shoulders, watching flames dance against the darkening sky. What happens now? I asked. Now we decide what kind of future we want. Together. I want normal, or as normal as possible given who you are and what you do. Normal, he repeated, considering. I can do normal. Or my version of it, which includes what? More luxury prisons? More philosophical debates about contracts and loyalty? I was thinking more along the lines of actual dates, meeting your friends, perhaps traveling somewhere that isn't related to business. He paused. Perhaps eventually. Marriage. I turned to look at him, stunned. Marriage? I realized the first time that particular milestone appeared in your life, I rather ruined it. I thought I might try again. Do it properly this time. He shifted to face me fully. I'm not asking now. We've both been through too much too quickly. But someday, when we're both ready, I'd like to button your wedding dress properly. From the beginning, this time. Tears pricked my eyes again. But these were different. Warm instead of painful. That's possibly the most ridiculous proposal that wasn't actually a proposal that I've ever heard. Is that a yes? It's a, ask me again when I'm ready and we'll see. I leaned against his shoulder. But it's not a no. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Somewhere in the house, Rosa was probably preparing dinner with her usual disapproving efficiency. Beyond the garden walls, the sea continued its eternal rhythm. And here, in this moment, two people who'd been forced together by circumstance had chosen to stay together by desire. It wasn't the future either of us had imagined. But perhaps it was better for being unexpected. "Hazel," Lorenzo said softly. Thank you. For choosing me. Even when you didn't have to." I tilted my head up to kiss him, slow and sweet. "Thank you for being worth choosing." As night settled fully over the villa, we remained in the garden, neither of us quite ready to break the spell of the moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new complications. Lorenzo's world was still dangerous, still morally ambiguous in ways that would probably always make me uncomfortable. And I was still learning to navigate being with someone whose past was so steeped in violence and control. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, we had each other, had made our choices, had burned away the last remnants of obligation and debt. The future stretched before us, unwritten and unknowable. But we'd face it together. Not because we had to, but because we'd chosen to. And that made all the difference. 3 years later, in a small chapel on the Ligurian coast, I stood in a wedding dress with pearl buttons. Lorenzo stood behind me, his fingers working each button with the same careful precision he'd shown that first time. "These are still impossibly difficult," I murmured. "Good thing you have help this time." When he finished the last button, I turned in his arms. Before us, 50 guests waited, Rosa in the front row with something that might have been tears in her stern eyes, Felix standing as Lorenzo's best man, Iris beside me as my maid of honor, finally understanding what had really happened 7 months after I disappeared from that other chapel. "Ready?" Lorenzo asked. "For this? For you? For whatever complicated future we're choosing? All of it." I took his offered arm. "Then let's go. Together this time." We walked down the aisle side by side, no bride being given away, no traditional separation. Just two people who'd found each other through impossible circumstances and chosen to build something real from broken contracts and difficult choices. When the priest asked if I took this man, I didn't hesitate. I do. And when he asked if Lorenzo took me, his voice was steady and sure. I do, completely. Forever. The kiss was everything a first kiss as husband and wife should be. Passionate and tender, public but intimate, the promise of everything we'd already built and everything we'd build together. As we pulled apart, Lorenzo's fingers found mine, interlacing in the way that had become habit. "No regrets," he murmured. "Only that it took a kidnapping for us to meet. We really should work on our meet-cute stories." His laugh echoed through the chapel, genuine and unguarded. "I'll work on that. For now, you're stuck with the truth." I can live with that. And surrounded by people we loved, in a chapel by the sea, with pearl buttons finally properly fastened and contracts finally burned away, we began the next chapter of our impossibly complicated, perfectly imperfect love story. Together. Always together.